The bitter, acrid tang of salt seeped through the vents of the beat-up truck, sticking to Gideon Vance's throat like a layer of iron scale. He coughed dryly and cranked the window tight, but it was no use. Out here in the Central Valley, the dust wasn't just dirt. It was a living entity, a parasite crawling into every pore, every circuit board, and every memory Gideon had tried to bury during his 10 years in Army acoustics. The Ford F-150 roared as it crested the final ridge before dropping into the valley floor. What hit his eyes wasn't the lush green fruit basket of the world seen on 90s postcards. Instead, it was a bleached graveyard. Tulare Lake, once the lifeblood of the entire region, was now nothing but a bone-dry basin, coated in a layer of salt crystals, shimmering under the 104 degrees Fahrenheit heat bearing the very breath of death. Gideon pulled up to the gate of the Vance farm. The wooden sign hung precariously, the words Vance and Sons, established 1948, weathered by the wind until they were nothing more than faint scars on the ancient grain. "Welcome home, Tech-Op," he muttered, his voice raspy. His father, Elias Vance, had passed away a month ago, right on this very soil. Not from disease, but from burning the candle at both ends. The police found him face down, his withered hand still clutching a fistful of dry earth, grey as wood ash. The bank loans taken out to keep the drip irrigation system running had sucked the last bit of life out of the 70-year-old man. Gideon stepped out of the truck. His combat boots sank deep into the fine powder. A sudden gust shrieked past, carrying an eerie howl. To an acoustic engineer, this wasn't just wind. It was the frequency of destruction. The wind here didn't blow to the rhythm of nature. It was warped by the parched heat and the hollow terrain, creating standing waves capable of resonating with human despair. "Gideon, is that really you?" A shaky voice cut through his thoughts. A few hundred yards away, past the busted barbed wire fence, stood Silas Miller, the family's longtime neighbor. Silas looked like he'd aged a decade since Gideon last saw him. His skin was leathery and burnt, his eyes clouded by the constant salt dust. "Uncle Silas," Gideon said, stepping forward to grip the old farmer's rough hand. "I'm so sorry about my father." Silas shook his head, his cracked lips trembling slightly. "Don't pity Elias, Gideon. He finally got some peace. Pity the ones left behind to fight the White Death." He pointed toward the dust clouds churning on the horizon. "It's coming, the salt storm. If you're planning on staying, get inside now. The Tulare salt will eat your lungs faster than hot lead." Just then, a fleet of jet-black SUVs, so clean they looked like a sore thumb against the backdrop, glided over the pothole-ridden road. They pulled up right in front of Silas' gate. A man stepped out wearing a navy suit without a single wrinkle, his hair slicked back. It was Garrett Sterling, CEO of AgriCorp. Sterling walked across the dusty ground with the confidence of a man who owned the world. He didn't look at Gideon. His eyes were fixed on Silas. "Mr. Miller," Sterling said, his voice ringing out as clear as a sales pitch. "I assume you've seen the latest contract. AgriCorp will buy this farm for 15% above current market value. In exchange, you can leave this godforsaken oven by tomorrow morning. We're building the Phoenix greenhouse system here. Closed-loop hydroponics. No soil needed, no fear of the wind." Silas' discovery grinded his teeth, his shaking hands tightening around the handle of his hoe. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations, Sterling. You want to turn the Central Valley into a plastic food processing plant?" Sterling smiled a cold, hollow expression. "No, we're saving it. Look around, old man. Your dirt is dead. It isn't soil anymore. It's chemical dust. Nothing grows here now except lung cancer. The apple. Sapple. He turned to look at Gideon, his sharp gaze raking over the old fatigues Gideon still wore. "Ah, you must be the Vance boy. Army engineer? Listen, son, math doesn't lie. Your farm is $400,000 in the hole. Last season's yield was a goose egg. AgriCorp is your only way out." Gideon didn't answer immediately. He reached down, picked up a piece of rusted steel from a scrap heap by the fence, and tapped it lightly. The sound was dull and heavy. "You're right, math doesn't lie, Sterling." Gideon looked up, his eyes so calm it made Sterling flinch. "But you're solving the wrong equation. You build greenhouses to hide from the salt storms." "Me? I'm going to break them to my will." Sterling burst out laughing, a contemptuous sound that echoed across the dead fields. "Tame the storm with a pile of junk? Good luck, Vance. I'll see you at the lawyer's office next week, when you realize you can't eat scrap metal to survive." As the AgriCorp convoy rolled away, leaving a screen of thick dust, Silas sighed. "You shouldn't have poked the bear, Gideon. He owns the water. He owns the politicians. And above all, he's right about one thing. The land is dead." Gideon looked toward his father's withered wheat fields, now stained a haunting white by the salt wind. He felt a faint vibration beneath his feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the displacement of massive air masses. That night, the salt storm truly hit. Gideon sat in his father's old shack, listening to the wind battering the corrugated metal roofing. In his acoustics unit, he had learned to analyze sound to pinpoint enemy artillery. Now he used those skills to listen to a new enemy. Screech, hiss, drone. The salt wind hummed at a frequency of about 200 to 500 hertz as it swept over flat surfaces, but when it hit the sharp edges of abandoned equipment, it created ultrasonic bands that shattered the structure of silicate particles. Under the influence of these sound waves, the tiny salt grains became as sharp as microblades, shredding the skin of any green shoot that dared to sprout. He lit an oil lamp and spread the farm's topographic map across the wooden table. The Vance 500 acres sat at the crossroads of cold coastal air and the blistering heat of the Mojave Desert. His father had planted windbreaks, but they had shriveled up long ago. "You tried to stop the wind with life, Dad," Gideon whispered. "But the wind was too strong. I'm going to use death to stop death." He began sketching strange lines onto the map. Not rows of trees, but geometric shapes. He calculated atmospheric pressure based on Bernoulli's principle. If he could create a low-pressure zone to the west and a resonance system in the center, he could force the storm to eat itself. A loud crash cut through Gideon's thoughts. He bolted out onto the porch. His flashlight cut through the thick salt fog. Not far away, Silas' farm was being torn apart. A small saltnado, fueled by the sudden temperature drop, had collapsed the old man's barn. Silas stood there in the middle of the white tempest, howling in vain as he watched his last bags of seed get ripped open and swept away by the gale. Gideon charged out, grabbed Silas, and dragged him into the storm cellar. In that moment, as the salt stung his face, Gideon realized something terrible. The salt storms weren't just taking the crops. They were stripping away the humanity of this land. Sterling didn't just want the dirt. He wanted the white flag from people who were already spent. The next morning, when the sun rose like a dull fireball behind the dust, Gideon didn't go looking for a lawyer. He drove to the port of Oakland, 3 hours away. At the shipyard scrap heaps, thousands of old rusted shipping containers, riddled with holes from salt water, sat abandoned. To the shipping companies, they were heavy, space-consuming industrial waste. To Sterling, they were symbols of the obsolete. But Gideon Vance stood before that pile of rusted steel, his eyes alight. He walked up to a 40-foot container and rapped his knuckles against the rusted hull. A deep, somber bong rang out, vibrating through the air. Resonant frequency, 60 hertz. Gideon smiled. Spot on. He pulled out his last credit card, the one he'd saved up during all those years of contract work for the military, and told the yard manager, "I want every rusted-out, beat-up container you've got, and I need them hauled to the valley by sundown." Gideon Vance knew he'd just crossed the point of no return. He was betting everything he had left his father's honor, his own future on, an idea the rest of the world would call insane. 6 heavy-duty semi-trucks swung onto Route 1998, creating a freak show the likes of which Kings County had never seen. On their backs sat massive steel monoliths, caked in rust like dragon scales, their original red and blue paint bleached into a silent chalky gray by the ocean sun. The mask and evergreen logos were nothing but peeling ghosts, looking like ancient hieroglyphs from a collapsed civilization. Gideon stood at the farm's main gate, his bowl cap pulled low to hide eyes bloodshot from a total lack of shut-eye. He clutched a stack of detailed schematics, a mess of lines marking air pressure specs and acoustic frequencies. Drop the first one at coordinates X104, angled exactly 15 degrees southwest. Gideon barked into his radio, his voice barely cutting through the roar of the diesel engines. The truck driver looked at him like he'd lost his marbles. "Look, Vance, what's the play with these holy iron boxes? You building a wall? The wind out here rips shingles right off the roof. What's this scrap metal gonna do?" Gideon didn't bite. He stepped up to the first steel block and used white chalk to mark a precise ellipse on the container wall. "Put it down right here. Don't ask questions. Just hit the markers." For the next 48 hours, the Vance farm turned into a chaotic construction zone. The screech of iron chains against truck beds was ear-splitting. A total of 32 40-footers and 16 20-footers were hauled in, arranged in a layout that seemed to have no rhyme or reason. From a distance, they looked like giant dominoes scattered across the dead fields by an invisible hand. By day 3, the town's curiosity turned into pure vitriol. A mob of farmers, led by Merle Haxton, the local tractor dealer, and AgriCorps, hired muscle pulled up to the gate. "Vance, get out here and give us an answer." Merle hollered, pounding his fist against the steel wall of the nearest container. Gideon stepped out holding a blowtorch, his welding mask pushed up onto his forehead. Sweat and iron dust had streaked his face into a dark mask. "What's the problem, Merle?" "The problem? Look at this eyesore." Merle pointed at the steel labyrinth behind him. "The whole valley is hunkering down for the salt storm, and you're turning the Vance place into a shipping container graveyard. You have any idea how much heat that steel soaks up? This junk is going to cook the air and bake whatever moisture is left right out of our dirt." Another farmer chimed in. "Damn right. The glare off that rusted tin is going to blind every driver on the 19-98. You're a public hazard, son. Haul this junk out of here, or we're calling the sheriff." Gideon looked at the crowd, then caught sight of Silas Miller standing on the edge, his face a picture of confusion and letdown. "I'm not building a junkyard," Gideon said, his voice low but carrying far thanks to the accidental resonance of the steel walls. "I'm building a filter. You call it scrap. I call it the only way we don't end up selling the farm to Sterling." "Hold my ass." Merle spat on the ground. "You're a grunt, Vance. You know how to pull a trigger, not how to work the land. Pack it in and head back to wherever you came from before AgriCorp sues you for being a blight on the neighborhood." Gideon didn't argue. He turned his back and flipped his mask down. The hiss of the torch flared up, blue sparks flying into the wicked twilight. He began the real work, turning those mindless iron boxes into physical resonators. Cassie, his 16-year-old daughter, walked out from the farmhouse with a meager plate of food. She looked at the massive steel blocks with hollow eyes. Ever since her mother passed and her father had been deployed indefinitely, Cassie had learned to live in the quiet, but her father's current insanity was the breaking point. "Dad," she said softly, her voice wavering against the clanking metal, "the kids at school are calling you the Tin Can Man. They say you've got shell shock, and you're building a fort to fight ghosts." Gideon stopped welding and looked at her through the protective glass. "Cassie, I'm not fighting ghosts. I'm fighting the silence of death." He pulled her toward a container he'd perforated with holes. "You hear that?" Cassie pressed her ear to the steel, a soft humming, like the breath of a sleeping giant. "That's the Helmholtz effect," Gideon explained, his fingers tracing the sharp steel cut. "The wind out there is hitting 40 miles an hour. But when it passes through this hole into the void inside, its frequency snaps. High-pressure waves hit low-pressure waves, and they cancel each other out. Right now, inside this box, the air is as still as a grave." Cassie shook her head, tears welling up. "But we need water, Dad. We need seeds, not acoustic physics. Sterling cut our irrigation lines this morning because you missed a payment on the water rights." Gideon froze. He knew Sterling would play dirty, but he didn't think he'd pull the plug this fast. Cutting water in the middle of a drought was a death sentence for any farm. He looked at the horizon, where the next salt storm was taking shape, a wall of grey dust looming over the valley like an ancient monster. "I just need more time," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to his daughter or himself. Gideon didn't sleep that night. He used a privately rented crane to shift the 20-footers into key spots within the labyrinth. He didn't stack them flush. He left gaps about 2 feet wide, but lined the edges with old scrap metal to create a structure like the intake of a jet engine. These were the Venturi nozzles. He did the math. When the storm slammed into the farm, the airflow would be squeezed into these narrow gaps. The wind speed would skyrocket, creating a localized vacuum inside the farm. In theory, this negative pressure would suck cool air up from the underground, through his father's old abandoned shallow wells and onto the surface. But theory was one thing. The reality of the Central Valley was a different animal. While Gideon was struggling with an anemometer, a shadow slipped in from the western fence. It was a group of masked men carrying crowbars and spray paint. They started smashing the steel pipes Gideon had spent hours installing. "Hey, get back!" Gideon yelled, charging toward them. A big guy, looking like one of AgriCorp's hired goons, stepped out to block him. "Listen, engineer, Sterling says he doesn't like this trash blocking his satellite soil surveys. Tear it down, or we'll tear down you and your girl." Gideon lunged at him. A brawl broke out among the rusted steel. The sound of punches and kicks echoed inside the hollow containers, creating a bone-jarring reverb. Gideon, with the hand-to-hand skills of a soldier, made short work of 2 of them, but the leader managed to smash his frequency monitor with a crowbar before running off. "You bastards!" Gideon roared, but the group vanished into the darkness of the approaching dust. He stood there, chest heaving, looking at the totaled gear at his feet. The numbers, the calculations, the only things keeping him anchored to reality were gone. All that remained were the giant steel blocks, silent and useless in everyone else's eyes. Cassie ran out and threw her arms around him, sobbing. "Dad, please stop. Can't we just throw in the towel and move somewhere else?" Gideon held his daughter, his calloused hands trembling. He looked up at the rusted containers. In the flickering static of the distant electromagnetic storm, they didn't look like iron boxes anymore. They looked like giant soldiers standing guard, holding the line. "No, Cassie." Gideon's voice turned to stone, a cold resolve taking over. "We aren't running. If they want a war, I'll show them the power of silence." He picked up the welding torch. The blue flame cut through the night once more. He didn't need a monitor anymore. He'd listened to the wind in the service long enough to know its language. He began welding steel fins along the Venturi gaps. He cut spiral grooves inside the ducts. Each container was no longer just a box. It was a natural centrifugal filter. He was designing it so that when the salt storm hit, the heavier salt particles would be flung against the inner walls by centrifugal force and drop into the hollow bottoms, leaving only scrubbed air to blow out the back. By dawn, the makeshift system was done. The Vance container graveyard now covered nearly 10 acres at the windward side of the property. From afar, it looked like a grotesque beast stitched together from the scraps of the industrial age. Sterling stood in his high-rise AgriCorp office, watching the Vance farm through binoculars. A nasty smirk crossed his face. "Let's see if your little symphony saves you now, Vance. This storm is going to blow the doors off this place." The sky turned a bruised purple, then pitch black. The wind began to shriek like a siren, signaling the start of the worst salt gale in a decade. Gideon ushered Cassie into the heart of a reinforced center container, where he'd set up a rough observation post through narrow slits. "Hold on tight," Gideon said, his hand resting on the final manual pressure valve. The first whistle wasn't like a normal wind. It was a razor-sharp metallic screech, tearing through the air like thousands of straight razors grinding together. The ultimate salt storm surged across the Tulare Basin, turning the Central Valley sky into a thick, lethal gray curtain. Visibility tanked to less than 6 feet. The sun was swallowed whole, even behind a man-made darkness reeking of chemicals and the bitter sting of crystallized salt. Inside the central container, Gideon gripped Cassie's hand. He could feel the steel block shuddering beneath his boots. The entire 100-ton system was trembling under the hellish pressure of the gale. "Daddy, it's gonna collapse," Cassie screamed, her voice muffled by an old gas mask. "Listen, Cassie. Listen to the rhythm." Gideon didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the last remaining mechanical pressure gauge. At first, the sound was pure hell breaking loose. The wind slamming against the steel walls created ear-splitting explosions. But seconds later, as the airflow was forced into the venturi throats Gideon had engineered, the sound began to shift. From a chaotic howl, it transitioned into a low-frequency hum that vibrated deep in the chest. Oh! The system began to sing. 32 empty shipping containers were now acting as giant flutes. As the salt wind passed through the 15-degree slits, its velocity redlined at nearly 100 miles per hour, but it was immediately sucked into the bellies of the Helmholtz resonators. There, inverse vortices were created, bleeding off the storm's energy. Gideon stood up and walked to a narrow observation slit shielded by tempered glass. What he saw was a miracle of physics. Outside the farm's perimeter, the salt storm was going scorched earth, whipping up tumbleweeds and flipping one of the Miller family's old tractors. The white salt dust looked like a blinding deluge. But right at the edge of the first row of containers, something strange happened. The wall of dust hit an invisible barrier. Instead of blasting into the wheat field, the tiny salt particles were sucked into the steel gaps, spinning wildly inside natural centrifugal filters before dropping to the bottom of the containers. The air exiting the back of the system was eerily still. It wasn't a gale anymore. It was just a cold breeze, crystal clear and free of salt. "It's working," Gideon whispered, cold sweat trailing down his spine. "The negative pressure is dropping the temp." Meanwhile, 3 miles northeast of the Vance Farm, AgriCorp's Phoenix greenhouse complex was living a nightmare. Garrett Sterling stood in the central command center, watching the surveillance monitors in horror. The high-tech greenhouse system, marketed as impenetrable, was buckling under the wind. The aluminum frames and tempered glass were too rigid. They couldn't kill the acoustic energy like Gideon's containers. When the salt wind hit the glass's resonant frequency, all hell broke loose. Crack! A massive glass pane exploded into thousands of shards. The salt wind rushed inside like a pack of starving wolves, instantly coating the tender hydroponic sprouts in white. The automated misting system tried to knock down the dust, but only made things worse. Salt met water to form a corrosive chemical sludge that gummed up sensors and fried the entire electrical grid. "Damn it! Turn on the backup pumps! Close the exhaust vents!" Sterling bellowed, but the monitors winked out one by one. His million-dollar tech was melting down against the raw power of nature. Back at the Vance farm, the steel symphony was reaching its crescendo. The sound was no longer a howl, but a permanent bass note, so deep it sent field mice scrambling out of their burrows. Gideon led Cassie out of the central container. Though the storm's darkness still loomed outside, they could take off their masks inside the steel labyrinth. The air here was shockingly cool. The Venturi effect hadn't just filtered the dust. Forcing air through the narrow gaps had caused a sudden pressure drop, pulling the temperature down nearly 10 degrees Celsius compared to the storm outside. "Daddy, look!" Cassie pointed at her feet. Under the flashlight's beam, tiny beads of dew began to form on the rusted steel walls. Large-scale condensation was taking place. The steel cooled rapidly in the low-pressure airflow, turning thousands of square feet of container surface into condensation mirrors. Clear drops began to roll down, dripping into plastic drainage channels Gideon had secretly installed through the night. Water, actual water, was flowing in the heart of a salt desert. "Sterling cut our water off," Gideon said, his voice thick with emotion. "But he can't cut the humidity in the air. We're making it rain, Cassie." He walked toward the western edge of the maze, where the first containers took the brunt of the storm. The salt hitting the steel sounded like pelting hail. Gideon pressed his hand against the wall, feeling the violent vibration. He knew that if the structure wasn't sound, a single failure point would cause the pressure to rip everything apart. But his rough-around-the-edge welds held firm. The imperfections of the scrap the dents, the natural holes were the secret sauce. They created calculated turbulence, preventing the build-up of a single standing wave that could shatter the metal. Suddenly, a faint light pierced the salt screen. A heavy-duty truck was staggering toward his farm. It was Silas Miller. His truck had been blown off course, the windshield was shattered, and he was white-knuckling it just to keep from being swept away. Gideon bolted past the steel barrier. The wind speed outside the protected zone instantly floored him. Salt bit into his skin like thousands of red-hot needles. "Silas, over here!" Gideon roared, crawling toward the truck with everything he had. He grabbed Silas's hand. The old man was nearly paralyzed from exhaustion and salt poisoning. He dragged him back into the footprint of the steel symphony. The moment they stepped past the last container wall, Silas collapsed, wheezing. He looked around, his bloodshot eyes wide at the eerie stillness. Above them the storm still raged, but here, in the shadow of the rusted steel blocks, not a single hair moved. "Is this heaven or hell, Gideon?" Silas whispered, his hand touching the water trickling down the container wall. "It's physics, Uncle Silas." Gideon helped him up. "And it's our answer to Sterling." The storm lasted 6 hours. When the final gusts faded and the salt dust began to settle, an unbelievable sight emerged. The entire Central Valley was blanketed in a white salt crust 4 inches thick, looking like a dead planet. Surrounding farms were stripped bare, trees defoliated, the soil chemically scarred. AgriCorp's greenhouse was nothing but a junkyard of aluminum and broken glass. The pricey sprouts inside turned to black rot. But at the Vance farm, a fan-shaped area stretching nearly a mile behind the container maze kept the deep brown color of moist earth. Not a single grain of salt had breached the core. In fact, thanks to the massive condensation runoff from the steel walls, the ground was wetter than it had been before the storm. Gideon walked out into the middle of the field. He knelt, thrusting his hand into the soft soil. Beneath the damp surface, he found it, a tiny, vibrant green weed sprout, still standing tall. A silence settled over the land, a post-apocalyptic silence, yet one thrumming with new life. The symphony was over, but its aftershocks were starting to ripple through the valley. In the distance, the sirens of police cars and ambulances wailed. But Gideon didn't care. He looked toward Sterling's office on the hill. The lights there were out. Gideon knew that by tomorrow morning, news of the stormless farm would spread like wildfire. He hadn't just blocked the wind. He had broken the logic of destruction Sterling used to run this town. Those rusted shipping containers weren't a graveyard anymore. They were the first headstones of a resurrection. The following morning's sunrise didn't bring the usual California warmth. It was a cold, silver streak of light piercing through the salt haze that was slowly vanishing over the barren fields of the Central Valley. As Gideon Vance stepped out of the central container, he saw Silas Miller kneeling by a drainage trench, cupping his rough hands into the flow of crystal-clear condensed water. This wasn't brackish well water, nor was it the canal water controlled by AgriCorp. It was the product of temperature and pressure differentials, the purest water this land had tasted in a decade of drought. "It's still flowing, Gideon." Silas looked up. The droplets caught in his beard, glinting like diamonds amidst the graveyard of rusted steel. "The storm's moved on, but your machine, it's still squeezing water out of thin air." Gideon nodded, but his eyes didn't linger on the water. He looked toward Highway 198. There, a lone black SUV sat parked in silence. Garrett Sterling didn't step out. He just rolled down the window, staring at Gideon's steel labyrinth, with the face of a man who had just watched the laws of physics get bent over a barrel. His Phoenix greenhouse behind the ridge was now nothing but twisted girders and shattered glass, a high-priced monument to the failure of rigid tech against the power of resonant acoustics. Sterling picked up his phone, his lips moving slightly. Then the vehicle pulled a U-turn, leaving a plume of salt dust in its wake. Gideon knew it wasn't a retreat. It was the setup for another slaughter. By afternoon, the fake peace shattered. Silas and 3 other farmers' men who had lost their entire grain stores in the storm drove up to the Vance farm. They hadn't come to argue. They looked at the damp brown strip of earth behind the containers, then at their own whitewashed salt flats, and they understood. "We need to know how you did it, Gideon." A man named Miller, no relation to Silas, said, his voice raspy. Sterling is leaning on us to sign the transfer papers this afternoon. He says the land is so salt-scorched it won't grow a damn thing for 1,000 years. But your wheat, it's still green. Gideon led them deep into the maze. It's not just a bunch of iron boxes. It's a pressure ecosystem. If you want to keep your land, we have to turn this whole county into one giant filter. But Sterling isn't going to play nice. Gideon's prophecy hit home that very night. As darkness swallowed the valley, a deathly silence hung over the farm. Cassie had fallen asleep in the central container after a long day helping Silas divert water into the furrows. Gideon sat atop the highest container block, his military-grade infrared binos scanning the western perimeter. 2 a.m., a bank of high-intensity floodlights suddenly kicked on from the access road. 3 heavy-duty trucks carrying Sterling's hired gunsmen, who weren't even wearing masks anymore because they knew Sterling had run out of patience, rolled in. They were hauling oxyacetylene torches and small-scale industrial explosives used in quarrying. "Tear that scrap heap down," a manager's voice barked over a megaphone. "Level it." Gideon didn't reach for a gun. He dropped from the container roof and pulled out a DIY remote. "Silas, get in position." The goons rushed into the steel maze, torches in hand, planning to drop the system's key pillars. But they made a fatal mistake. They didn't know a damn thing about acoustics. The moment the first guy touched a torch to the wall of container number 12, Gideon triggered the backup intake fans he'd rigged in the Venturi throats. The night air began rushing in at high velocity. But this time, instead of letting it flow, Gideon partially choked the exhaust ports. The sound immediately shifted from a low hum to a high-frequency shriek, hitting the 16,000 hertz mark. It was like 10,000 needles stabbing through their eardrums. Sterling's crew staggered, clutching their ears in agony. In the tight, hollow spaces of the containers, the sound reverberated and amplified tenfold. The men with the torches dropped their gear, collapsing from vertigo and nausea. It was the non-lethal weapon Gideon had learned about in the service using sound waves to trash the vestibular system. "I'm gonna kill you, Vance," the manager screamed, pulling a handgun and firing wildly into the steel walls. The bullets ricocheted off the steel with sharp, metallic pings. Gideon slipped through narrow gaps only he knew. He appeared behind the manager, disarming him with an old iron bar in one fluid motion. "Get the hell out of here," Gideon growled, his voice amplified by the container's dome effect until it sounded like an angry god. "This land doesn't belong to Sterling anymore. It belongs to the people who listen to it." The showdown played out amidst torch smoke and sweeping flashlight beams. Silas and the other farmers, armed with clubs and long-simmering hatred, poured out from the maze's crannies. They pushed the goons back toward their trucks. But just as victory seemed within reach, a massive explosion rocked the ground at the base of the hill. Gideon froze. Sterling had played a dirtier card. He'd used explosives to take out the county's main canal pumping station, the only source that still provided a trickle of water to the edge of the Vance farm. He couldn't break Gideon's steel wall by force, so he decided to starve the land by cutting the final lifeline. As the goons retreated with arrogant laughter, Gideon stood silently in the smoking steel maze. Silas walked up, his old face gray in the moonlight. "It's over, Gideon. The pump station is toast. Without irrigation, your wheat's gonna wither in 3 days, storm or no storm." Gideon looked at the burning pump station in the distance, then down at the floor of container number 5, where condensation was still dripping steadily. A reckless idea took root. "No, Silas. You just gave us the last piece of the equation." He pulled Silas into a container located at the farm's lowest point. There, Gideon had dug a deep pit, connecting directly to his father's dried-up aquifer. "You see that?" Gideon pointed to the container wall. Because of the flash cooling from the nighttime Venturi system, the interior steel was sweating heavily. The condensation wasn't just a few liters, it was hundreds of gallons. "If we link all 48 of these into a closed-loop heat exchange network," Gideon said rapidly, sketching on the fobbed steel, "we can use the daytime wind pressure to drive this condensation down into the dry well. We don't need Sterling's pump station. We're going to turn this farm into a massive water processor fueled by the next salt storm." But what they didn't expect was the self-sustaining ecosystem already taking shape. While checking the crevices beneath the containers, Cassie let out an excited yell. She pointed into the narrow gaps between the steel blocks. There, thousands of native spiders and insects were weaving dense webs. These webs, a perfect biological structure, were acting as secondary fine dust filters that no machine could replicate. Even a few small birds of prey had started nesting in the high crannies where the wind couldn't reach. "Look, Daddy, they're helping you protect the wheat." Cassie smiled, her eyes bright for the first time in months. Gideon realized his steel wall wasn't a dead object anymore. It had started a symbiosis with the land. The rust on the steel was reacting with the salt and moisture, forming a protective iron oxide layer, while providing trace minerals to the water dripping into the soil. However, Sterling wasn't giving them time to celebrate. An emergency notice from a law firm arrived. AgriCorp had bought out Kings County's debts and declared the Vance farm a biohazard due to illegal scrap accumulation. They were demanding a forced eviction within 48 hours. "He's trying to use the law to do what dynamite couldn't," Silas spat, gritting his teeth. Gideon leaned back against the cold steel wall. He felt the systems pulse the night wind through the steel tubes, creating a somber cello melody. "Then we'll show them what a real hazard looks like," Gideon said, his eyes fixed on the steel maze that had become a biological fortress. "Silas, call every farmer left. Tell them to bring every scrap of metal they can find, old pipes, tin roofing, car shells. We aren't just protecting this farm. We're taking this symphony to the whole valley." The Kings County eviction notice, pinned to the rusted gates of the Vance farm, looked like a white death warrant in an ocean of salt. But those final 48 hours didn't pass in despair. Instead, an unprecedented reverse exodus took place. From every corner of the Central Valley, beat-up trailers and trucks loaded with scrap-junked car frames, rotted pipes, and corrugated roofing torn off by previous storms descended on Gideon's place. The farmers weren't coming to gawk at the crazy man anymore. They were coming to join the orchestra. Gideon stood atop the highest container, his military radio crackling non-stop. He wasn't a solo act with a welder anymore. Silas coordinated the blacksmiths. Cassie guided the local kids filling steel voids with river rocks to create thermal mass, and the rest of the men hustled to lay pipes according to the fractal blueprints Gideon had etched into the dirt. Right at sunset on the second day, with the eviction deadline ticking down to the hour, a fleet of shiny black AgriCorp SUVs, flanked by patrol cars, appeared at the head of Highway 19-T. Garrett Sterling stepped out, clutching a legal portfolio, his face wearing a look of cold-blooded triumph. "Time's up, Vance," Sterling announced over a bullhorn. "The sheriff has the order. This entire heap of junk gets scrapped. This land now belongs to the AgriCorp Bioreserve." Gideon didn't budge. He just looked at the sky. A heavy, bruised mass of clouds was churning in from the direction of Lake Tulare. The second salt storm of the season the one meteorologists predicted would wipe the slate clean of any remaining life was hitting ahead of schedule. "Sterling, do you hear that?" Gideon asked, his voice eerily calm. "I only hear the bulldozers waiting on my command." Sterling barked. "No, that's the sound of a pressure drop," Gideon countered. "If you step onto this farm right now, you might make it. If not, you better pray your greenhouse glass is tougher than it was last time." The storm hit with freakish velocity. Sterling and his entourage were forced to dive into their armored SUVs for cover right at the farm's entrance. The sheriff ordered the dozers to stand down and hunker. This time, the Steel Symphony wasn't a solo track from 48 containers. With thousands of pieces of fresh scrap linked in a fractal network, all 500 acres of the Vance property had become an industrial-scale atmospheric filter. The sound that rose up wasn't a shriek or a howl. It was a deep, guttural roar, like ancient war drums echoing from underground. The acoustic waves from the steel blocks resonated in sync, creating a zone of destructive interference that blanketed the entire area. When the salt dust hit the farm's boundary, it didn't just fall. It was vacuumed up by centrifugal vortices from the scrap pipes, turning into white dust columns trapped inside the containers. Inside the labyrinth, the real magic started. Thanks to the closed-loop heat exchange system, Gideon had finished with the new scrap. The temperature cratered so fast that the moisture in the storm air was forced to liquefy. Water wasn't just dripping anymore. It was gushing through old pipes, dumping straight into the dry aquifer and overflowing into the irrigation trenches. 3 hours later, the storm broke. When Sterling stepped out of his SUV, he stood frozen. The rest of the valley was still a deathly white wasteland. But the Vance farm, and now Silas's land and the neighboring plots that had linked into the system, emerged like a lush oasis in a salt desert. The Vance wheat hadn't just survived, it looked like it had put on inches overnight thanks to the flood of water and minerals. The deep forest green of the stalks stood in violent contrast to the surrounding white, creating a surreal portrait of resurrection. The King's County Sheriff stepped out of his rig, looking at the salinity meter in his hand. The needle hit 0. Sterling, the salt count here is lower than it is in town. This isn't a biohazard. This is the cleanest patch of dirt in the state of California. The eviction notice was ripped up on the spot in front of local news crews who had followed the convoy. Sterling looked at Gideon, then at the rusted containers now shrouded in a cool, refreshing mist. He realized his closed greenhouse empire had just hit a brick wall. Who would need million-dollar agricorp tech when they could save their land with junk and physics? 10 years later, the Vance farm was no longer a steel graveyard. Those once rusted containers were now completely blanketed in lush vines and native wildflowers. They looked more like ancient ruins of a jungle civilization than industrial scrap. Gideon's acoustic structure was now known as the Vance Miller System, a world-class land conservation solution honored by the UN. It didn't just stop storms, it recharged aquifers and created a temperate microclimate for the entire valley. Cassie, now an environmental engineer, stood atop the central container, now renovated into a biological observatory. She looked down at the golden wheat fields rippling in a light breeze. "Do you hear that, Dad?" she asked Gideon, now a silver-haired man that with eyes as sharp as ever. Gideon smiled, resting his hand on a rusted steel wall that felt warm under the afternoon sun. "I don't hear the land screaming anymore, Cassie." "So what do you hear?" "I hear the silence," Gideon whispered. "The silence of a land that finally found its peace." Beneath their feet, the wheat swayed. The river rocks inside the containers silently regulated the temperature. And those rusted shells, the things the world had once thrown away, still stood there, sturdy and proud, guarding the green of the valley.